think my insecurity was if we all moved to Swift, that I'd have to learn a new language. But what's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another video. This is clearly a very different video. I'm joined today by fellow YouTuber Kilo Loco, Kyle Lee. I got stuck with the K there because I don't know which one he goes by. Take it away, Kyle.
What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Kilo Loco. And today me and Afraz are just gonna be just talking about what it's like to be iOS developers, I guess.
Yeah. So a lot of you guys in the comments on my channel, at least, and I'm sure Kyle gets this a lot, have questions about like careers. How did you get into iOS? Did you go get a computer science degree? Do you need math? Like, what are, like, do you do Storyboard, SwiftUI? Like, how do I get a job, right? All the meaty questions that you really don't get answered when you search iOS. You get a lot of tutorials, which are great and all, but those questions are fairly important too. So I figured it was time that two people that have been doing iOS for a decent amount of time share some of those things. So we've got a bunch of topics and questions for you guys here. We're just going to go through them and hopefully someone gets something valuable out of this. So that said, let's jump on over to this list. So first things first, let's each go through a little bit of background. So Kyle, how did you get into iOS? Did you go for comp sci, college? What's your story?
Yeah, so I pretty much started off by I went the self-taught route. I technically do have like an associate's degree in psychology, which is useless even if you wanted to go into psychology. I don't have a bachelor's in CS and didn't really have like a strong like programming background or like an official technical background, but I had been around computers all my life. My dad, he was around computers. He knew how to code at one point. He was mostly into the hardware side though. But anyways, like I've been around computers all my life, and then eventually in 2014 I decided to like get into development. I had been jumping around from jobs, like from second jobs. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, and I decided to get into iOS development and started with Objective-C. Now, you can't really make an iPhone app with just Objective-C by itself. You need to know UIKit, but I didn't know that when I was starting out. I was just trying to learn the language, and that's not how you make iPhone apps. But luckily, Swift came along like a month or two later, and I started dabbling in Swift a little bit, like when it had first came out, but actually didn't take it seriously until like a whole year later. I started like a year later in 2015, late 2015. I was like learning through like Udemy courses, Udacity courses, Lynda courses, whatever I could find on YouTube. And then I don't really learn well through reading articles, but also articles as well. And then eventually I put out my first apps in the App Store in December of 2015 and got my first paid gig as an iOS developer in April of 2016.
Awesome. That's so one thing that just stuck out there, which I didn't know, I actually learned it 2 seconds ago, just like everybody else watching right now, is your dad was sort of into programming, more so on the hardware side. Is that right?
Yeah, my dad has like a strong technical background. Like he's been working with computers almost all his life, like even as a kid. Like he told me that he like hacked his school one time and stuff like that before like it was even like, people like it was mainstream to even know what hacking was about.
Yeah.
So like he was like doing all kinds of stuff, but like he was usually focused on like hardware based stuff.
Yeah.
So he was constantly building computers and stuff like that, but like I never really went down that route with him. I just knew that, or I was just kind of like aware that that kind of existed.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because I have a similar situation of my dad also very technical, and he was on the hardware side of things of like the actual wiring up and putting computers together and stuff. And not that I ever went down that path with him either, but interesting similarity. What also strikes me fairly interesting is I also started with Objective-C, and I remember when when I started, there was like no content at all about like iOS. There was like Objective-C content, which was great. And then you would go write one file and you'd realize that you have no interface. And this is like, like there was just like nothing out there. And there was one channel that I still remember to this day. This is back like way like 2010, when like the right after the App Store was announced, is kind of when I got started. And I can't even say like I got started, because like that's kind of a falsehood. It was kind of just me like wasting time online, and I was like, oh look, iPhone apps, these are kind of cool. And then it's kind of a rabbit hole from there, right? You make one thing and you're like, oh well, how do I add this, and how do I add that? And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, Swift is like a whole other story of, I was one of those people who was very big Objective C from the beginning. So when Swift finally came out, my stance was, this is syntactical sugar. We don't need this. And the reason was kind of because I didn't know Swift. And I think my insecurity was, if we all moved to Swift, that I'd have to learn a new language. But I eventually, nevertheless, I learned it because working professionally, right? Like code bases started to migrate to Swift. So my argument of Swift is useless didn't really hold up very well. And I think thankfully so, because Swift is so much better on so many levels than Objective C.
Yeah, I think that's like, it's this really weird thing that I constantly have to like bring up to people at work when I'm referring to the development community, is that it's really weird that developers are so tied to their languages and their frameworks. Like it's almost like a part of us, and like if you say anything bad about the language that we primarily lean towards, it's like you're offending us personally. Like,
Yep.
oh well, Swift can't do this. I'm like, you want to fight, bro? Like
No, it's so true. It's so true. And it's so funny you bring that up. This is so digressing from iOS, but before I was into iOS and kind of mobile, I dabbled with like backend. And to this day, I'm still a very big fan of PHP. And there's just like, people will have wars over PHP and Python. And I don't like anything backend. And I just don't even partake in those conversations, because I just get so offended personally, where I really shouldn't. But like, I totally hear you on it.
yeah, it's just so interesting because like if you think about it, like in a lot of respects, I think that you know, coding is kind of like art in a way. Like
It is.
that's kind of how I feel like it's kind of like artistic in a way, because there's the tool, which is the language that you can write with, and then like how you actually write your code is kind of like the unique piece, right? Like there's some of you in that, and it's just like really interesting because if you think about it from that perspective where code is art, and like what like the way that you decide to design stuff is art, the artist doesn't usually, like you don't really, I mean I could be wrong, but you don't usually hear about artists being attached to a single tool, like a paintbrush. I mean maybe they are, but like I don't think that an artist would be like offended if you said this paintbrush is bad, right?
Yeah.
Like I think that end result is usually what is usually
Judged.
the desired thing. Like
Yeah.
it's not the thing that you get defensive about, but
Yep.
it's just interesting. It's a really interesting thing that I've noticed about the development community, which I want to do everything in Swift too, so I kind of get it, but at the same time I understand that I need to diversify my skill set too.
Yep. Yeah. That's actually a really good segue. Paintbrush, different tools and frameworks for development. Super contested, very subjective topic. What are your thoughts on UI kit, storyboard for interfaces, I guess, programmatic, storyboard, or Swift UI?
Yeah, like so I think I've been working with Swift UI a lot lately.
So am
I really
I.
enjoy it, and it's really cool, but there are still limitations. It's still brand new.
Yep.
I still can't figure out how to change the navigation bar color without using appearance. Like that just drives me insane. And even doing navigation itself is just like ridiculously hard to figure out like what is the right approach, because Apple doesn't really guide us on that.
Yep.
So Swift UI is great, but and I think that yeah, if you want to use it for like a production level app, then go for it. It's just like there's still a lot of room to grow,
Yeah.
and that's my perspective on that. But in regards to UI kit and programmatic versus storyboards, um, I still think that storyboards can be extremely useful. I still think that you can use them in big projects, and I know that's like kind of like a controversial statement right there, because a lot of people
Very
will say like,
controversial.
"Oh no, you can't use storyboards
Yeah.
in big projects because just the merge conflicts are just impossible to go around."
Yep.
And I think that like you can get around that by just having a lot of communication with the team. It does require like a lot of communication if you're going to have storyboards as a team, because like as soon as you open it, there could be changes.
Yep.
But like that's just like, if you're not making a change in the storyboard, then you're just like like a git stash away, or like a git restore away from just removing that change from your file. And like honestly, I don't really see how often, like I don't understand how often people are planning on using, like changing the UI for their storyboards. Like once you set something up, generally you shouldn't be changing the UI for your app that frequently. So there shouldn't be that many merge conflicts. And if you're, you know, segmenting everything apart, I think that it makes it really easy where you're only dealing with certain flows and storyboards. But yes, it is a problem. I think it has gotten better, especially with the ability to do dependency injection with storyboards. I think that was like one of the things that kind of took me away from it for a while. But with all of that said about storyboards, I still personally now prefer to work programmatically. I can just see everything in my head and I don't really need to use the storyboard. And I have like some helper functions that allow me to just write stuff out a little bit quicker. But
Right.
I
Yeah.
like both of them, to be honest.
I think a really key kind of point that you brought up is like it's very subjective, right? In sense of like what you're doing. So I guess let's take a step back. So SwiftUI, right? I'm totally there with you. I think a lot of people ask, right? Is it production ready? Production ready is such a subjective thing, right? Like if we're talking about Facebook, for example, right? They're not going to rewrite the Facebook app in SwiftUI. It's an enormous code base. There's a learning curve. There's a question of why, right? Does it really
Yeah.
improve your like why, right? Is at the end of the day, like there's engineering hours going in from like a dev perspective. So it's really justification. Now, if you're building a fresh new app, like you said, I mean, if SwiftUI is if that's your thing, go for it, right? Like there's navigation is supported. Apple doesn't have a lot of guidance on it. There's a lot of tutorials out there and people are kind of learning in the community. I think so one thing I find really interesting is if I was learning iOS today, I think SwiftUI would be like the greatest thing since like sliced bread, right? Like all the mental gymnastics of like view controllers and like architecture and like navigation stacks and like it's like SwiftUI abstracts so much of it away from you. I think that's like the greatest advantage of SwiftUI, but it also comes with it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? It also comes with the flip side of like, okay, like there's no controller business anymore. How do we navigate, right? And like, I think that's the catch 23 with SwiftUI. I've lately been dabbling a lot in it, mostly because I'm kind of figuring it out myself and also learning. And I think I'm pretty blown away. And my stance has evolved quite a bit. In the beginning, I think it was very much so. In the beginning, I think my stance was very much so. This is like kind of marzipan catalyst of Apple's attempt to go cross-plat, and it's not going to take off because Catalyst they tried, didn't work out too well. People weren't super on board with it. But generally, SwiftUI, I think it has a future, and it's pretty apparent that they being Apple has made a huge investment in it. Now, Storyboard and Programmatic, your super controversial statement. So let's talk about that. Using Storyboard in a large app, I think again it's subjective, which might be partially a cop out, but my reasoning is so I used to work on a fairly large app, Fortune 100 company, right? They had a really large app and they used storyboards everywhere. But what they did was super interesting. Every team would own their own storyboard, and only one person would be working on like stuff where they were touching the storyboard, right? They would have different
Yeah.
files.
Communication.
Yeah, so communication, right? Communication and organizing like how the process is set up. And my experience there was pretty like we never had merge conflicts in our storyboards. Like if anything, we had more merge conflicts in our programmatic approaches, which is kind of ironic.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
but that said, I do think one thing that storyboards are really good for that I think I try to avoid a lot in code is constraints, right? If you're doing auto layout, certain like suit if you have a very like nested hierarchy for your view, some constraints, for me at least in my head, programmatically get jumbled, right? If I'm doing like programmatic layout, right, I go with frame-based layout, depends what I'm doing. But I think storyboards definitely do help if you have a very, very complex setup and you want to kind of iterate quickly. That said, the flip side of that is take your time and build everything out into smaller pieces and smaller views, and you can do it programmatic as well. I think 98% of my time I'm programmatic, and then the other 2% I debate about being programmatic and sometimes do storyboard. But it's I don't know. I think the takeaway in my mind is like there's no really right answer. It's like do whatever kind of works best for you, and like if you're doing it professionally, like you should in my experience at least, you should at least be comfortable with all three options.
Yeah, like it wouldn't be a technical talk if somebody didn't say that it depends, right?
Yep.
but like yeah, like yeah, I like doing stuff programmatically, but I think storyboards are completely viable. I would say if you're just learning, learn storyboards. It's going to help you be familiar with the different elements that you're going to be working with on the screen, the different views and stuff like that. And then it wasn't until after I was extremely comfortable with storyboards, all the different views and their behaviors and their properties, that I was able to actually make the leap into programmatic views.
Yep.
And then I was able to like fully understand like, okay, this is how it works. And then when I'm coding stuff up like programmatically, I can see it in my head. I don't even really need to run it. I just run it once I'm done with everything, and then it's like pretty much it's really close to whatever I expected it to be. But going back over to something that you kind of touched on with SwiftUI, um, I don't think that you necessarily said this, but like if you are just starting out and you haven't learned iOS development, I actually wouldn't say to learn SwiftUI first. Um, Even though I think that it might be an easier way to get started with iOS development specifically and just like building screens and stuff like that,
Yep.
you would be doing yourself a huge disservice in understanding like the fundamentals of like programming in general, because I think that the imperative approach is actually extremely helpful for understanding the concepts of programming, like just the fact that you have to go like kind of line by line and tell the view how to react
Yep.
is like very helpful, I think, in understanding. And that might be because like I'm coming from a imperative, like I started out learning imperative, so I'm biased and I think that imperative is the way that you should learn first. But even if I was going to teach somebody fresh, that's the way that I would recommend. Like I would get you ready to learn SwiftUI, but I wouldn't start you off with SwiftUI. And then also the benefit with learning UI kit first in imperative programming is that if you can understand UI kit, how it tends to break stuff out into like delegates and like the general like patterns that are used to implement UI kit, what Apple has put in there,
Yep.
you'll have a much easier time understanding the Apple docs and using any of their other frameworks, because everything else that you use in UI kit that's first that Apple has released, like let's say like motion or AV kit or something like that, if you're comfortable with working with UI kit, you can actually start guessing at how some of this stuff fits together with these other frameworks, because like all the other libraries are kind of built in the same like architecture kind of.
Yep.
And it then makes it so that when you go to the Apple docs, you'll actually be able to read them as opposed to them just seeming like gibberish or not being very helpful at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah. No. So you bring up a really good point. So I think so. First, let me say I completely agree. I think when it's a lot easier to go from UI kit to Swift UI or to something else that Apple provides, any of their other frameworks. And I think the reason for that is UIKit really forces you to very, very intimately know the fundamentals of lifecycle management, how to pass around data, and just concepts of singletons, right? Fundamentals. I think SwiftUI, I think a lot of people sometimes, including myself, I think we get very into the weeds of SwiftUI being like a full-on replacement. But even if you look around today, right, people that are starting to dabble with SwiftUI, there's this approach of like SwiftUI plus UI kit, right?
Yeah.
There's limitations and things there. And I think the reason the SwiftUI really jumps out at me personally is if I knew nothing about programming and I saw that with a couple of view builders, I can put together a really cool screen, I think that's a really good way to get myself excited and motivated. Now, in terms of it being a disservice long term, I think that depends a little bit on your goals, right? If you ultimately want to build an app, you're gonna need to know UI kit and you're gonna need to be able to read, learn, and kind of guess your way through the rest of the resources Apple provides. If your goal is to get a job, I mean, that's also very different, right? If you want to get hired as a professional iOS dev, I would say today, like like UI kit's not going anywhere, right? Anytime soon,
Yeah.
in my opinion. I think knowing Swift UI helps because I do think there is an interesting notion of so in Swift UI, right? So people often conflate Swift UI as like a UI framework, right? You still need to, although it's like reactive and declarative, you still need to know how to make an API call. Granted, you're going to use a observable object or whatever to update your view. You still need to know the fundamentals of that. You still need to know how to put together a model, right? Like how things get passed around to a degree. But I definitely don't disagree that UI kit will probably help you in your kind of path to mastering the fundamentals.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like feel free to learn whatever you want to learn. Like, don't let anybody, steer you from doing whatever you want to do, because there's going to be, you're going to hear a perspective from here. You're going to hear a perspective from a different video, a different podcast, a friend, whatever.
Yep.
And at the end of the day, it's like whatever keeps you going and keeps you interested in programming is probably going to be the most beneficial thing for you, as long as you keep at it and you keep going down the road of programming, just
Yep.
being in there on a daily or like really frequently will just help you in general.
That's a really good segue to our next topic here of how do you keep yourself motivated? I think there's a lot of there's a lot of folks out there who go and they feel like they're kind of stuck in like tutorial purgatory, right? Like one video after another, but they don't feel the confidence to go and either apply for a job or they kind of go and try to put multiple video components together and they're just kind of lost.
Yeah. So for this, I usually like have I would usually recommend that, do you have like something that you're passionate about? Because a lot of people, some people do this because they enjoy coding, and some people do this just for the money, which is, that's perfectly fine. You need to pay the bills, and or you just want to have the lifestyle of a developer, whatever, that's fine. So what I would say is like, what is something that you're actually passionate about? If not code, or even if it is code, is there something else that you're passionate about? Like, I know that a lot of developers also seem to be interested in games too, like video games too. So it's like, are you passionate about video games? Or maybe you're not. Are you passionate about pottery or veganism or whatever, right? Like, what is something that you also enjoy? And if you're like stuck in this like tutorial hell where it's like, yeah, you can follow along on tutorials, you might even have an idea of how to build it out before you go through the tutorial, but you just don't know a unique idea, I would say, well, what's something that you're passionate about, and then make an app around that. And then just start by like thinking, what is the most minimal thing? What is like the problem that you can solve? Let's say it's pottery, right? um what are the different pot shapes that you can make in pottery? I don't know. This is just coming off the top of my head. Like, so
I'm
like
wigging
then
it.
maybe you could have like a collection view, right? Or a grid where you're showing like the different pottery, like the shapes of the pots. and then you have a name under it, and then you tap on it and it goes to a detail screen where it tells you more about that and how it came about. And then you just put that out there in the App Store, and then you have an app published. And I promise you, if you're able to go through that process of putting an app in the App Store, like your perspective is going to completely change about yourself. Like you're going to feel accomplished, and you're going to be motivated to do more, because you're going to realize, like, if you were able to keep it simple enough where it's just an MVP and it's just like something small, and you put it out there in the App Store, you're gonna look back and be like, oh, that wasn't too bad. That's doable. I could keep doing that. That's easy, actually. Now that I know the process. So that's what I would say is, like, focus on something that you are passionate about. Make an app as simple as you can and get it out there in the App Store, and that's going to definitely keep you going.
Yeah. I don't think I have much to add. I mean, I think you nailed it. I mean, the three terms, right? Keep it simple, right? Keep it simple, go through the motions. Once you have an app on the App Store, I don't know about you or how you felt when you published your first app, but you can go and pull up the App Store and like type in your app and show people your name is on there. It just hits differently, right?
It does.
It's amazing, right? Like I remember I still have the source code for my very first app. It was 2 buttons and a label, and all it did was it changed the size of the label. And mind you, this was like 10 years ago, so Apple wasn't super, they didn't scrutinize how simple it was, and they approved it. I don't know if that would be the case today, but
Dude, that's hilarious. My second app was that. That was my second app that I put out in my App Store.